Imagine waking up with a terrible headache, no big deal, right? Just another bad day. But in 1918, that headache could have been your death sentence. In less than 24 hours, you'd be coughing up blood. In 48 hours, your skin would turn blue. By the third day, well, you wouldn't make it to the third day. The Spanish flu wasn't like any disease, you know. It didn't prey on the weak, it preyed on the young and healthy. 25-year-old soldiers died faster than 8-year-olds, and you know, what the most terrifying part was, no one knew how to stop it. Did you think you would survive 1918? Let me tell you, because you're completely wrong, and because this story will forever change how you view the modern world. But before I tell you why you'd die in 3 days, you need to understand what it was really like to live in 1918. And when I say understand, I'm not talking about numbers or dates you memorized in school. I'm talking about immersing yourself in a world that will make you thankful you weren't born this year. Forget everything you know about modern medicine. In 1918, there were no antibiotics. Zero. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered until 10 years. Later, if you had a simple infection, an ingrown toenail, a cut on your finger, you could die. That's just how it was. Hospitals were basically warehouses for people waiting to die. There were no mechanical ventilators, no ICUs, not even saline. The most a doctor could do was give you painkillers or, believe it or not, bleed you. That's right, take your blood, because they believed it would cure anything. Now imagine the perfect scenario for a catastrophe. World War I had ended. Millions of young, strong soldiers were returning home, and ships were overcrowded. Trains were packed, cities were bursting with people. Everyone was crowded together. Everyone was celebrating. Everyone was cheering each other on, never knowing what was to come. And here's the detail you never thought of. In 1918, 70% of the population was under 30. They were people in the prime of their health, at the peak of their physical strength, exactly the kind of people you'd think would survive anything. They were completely wrong. The personal hygiene you consider basics simply didn't exist. People bathed once a week. If they were lucky, they brushed their teeth with salt and ash. They wore the same clothes for days on end. And you know what's most frightening? They had no idea what a virus was. To them, diseases came from miasmas, bad air, evil vapors. When someone got sick, the whole family gathered around the bed, breathing the same air, touching the same sick person, without masks, without gloves, without anything. It was the perfect setting for the apocalypse, and it was coming. And then, somewhere in the world, historians still debate whether it was in Kansas or France something terrible began to spread. It wasn't a war cry, it wasn't an explosion, it was just an American soldier waking up with a fever in a military camp. His name was Albert Gitchell, 21 years old, healthy as a bull. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, he went to the infirmary complaining of a headache and fever. No big deal, right? Soldiers got sick all the time, but within hours, something impossible was happening. Other soldiers began showing up with the same symptoms 10, 20, 50, within a week. More than 500 men were in bed. At Fort Riley, a camp that was supposed to be training warriors had been transformed into a makeshift hospital. And here's the part that separated this flu from anything else humanity had ever seen. It didn't follow the rules. Normal flus killed babies and the elderly, the most fragile. This flu did exactly the opposite. It preyed on the young and strong. 25-year-old soldiers died faster than 8-year-olds. Healthy nurses collapsed mid-shift. Doctors treating other patients would wake up dead the next day. It was as if the disease had a sadistic preference for the healthiest. The symptoms would begin innocently: fever, headache, that common flu feeling. But then, within hours, something horrifying would happen. Fever would rise to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees Celsius. People would start coughing up blood. Their faces would turn blue. It wasn't a normal color. It was a dark blue, almost black, as if they were drowning inside. And they were, their lungs filling with fluid so quickly that they were literally drowning in their own blood. In Boston, a doctor described patients bleeding from every orifice, nose, ear, even eye. They looked like zombies from a nightmare, but the most terrifying thing was the speed. With normal flu, you'd be sick for a week, 2 weeks. This flu killed within 24 hours, sometimes less. There are reports of people waking up feeling fine in the morning and being dead before dinner. And while Fort Riley thought it was a local problem, ships loaded with infected soldiers were already crossing the Atlantic, carrying this biological bomb to every corner of the world. Within weeks it would reach war-torn Europe, then Asia, Africa, and South America. What had begun with an American soldier with a headache was about to become the greatest catastrophe in human history. And no one, Absolutely no one was prepared for what happened when this biological bomb reached the cities. Maria Santos was 23 years old and lived with her husband and 2 young children in a boarding house. In São Paulo, it was October 1918 when the flu arrived in Brazil. Maria worked in a textile factory cramped in unventilated warehouses with 200 other women. The perfect setting for contagion. One Monday morning, Maria woke up with a terrible headache. She thought it was work fatigue. She went to the factory. As usual, by mid-afternoon, she started to feel sprained. By 6 p.m., when she returned home, she already had a high fever. On Tuesday, Maria was unable to get out of bed. Her husband, Joe, stayed home to care for her. Back then, that was what families did. They gathered around the sick man. Their 2 children, ages 3 and 5, slept in the same bed as their ailing mother. Wednesday morning, Maria was bleeding. Her skin had a frightening bluish tinge. Joe rushed to the nearest hospital but found lines of hundreds of people. Exhausted doctors shouted that there were no more beds, no more medicine, no more hope. Joe returned home and found Maria dead, 23 years old, 3 days into her illness. But the tragedy was just beginning. On Thursday, Joe woke up with the same symptoms. On Friday, their oldest son was also ill. By Saturday, both were dead. Only the 3-year-old boy was left alone, crying beside 3 corpses in a boarding house where more than half the tenants had already died. This story has been repeated millions of times around the world. In Philadelphia, entire families disappeared. In a week, houses sat empty with open windows and rotting food on the table in Mumbai. Orphaned children roamed the streets in groups, searching for any living adult who could care for them. Hospitals became morgues. In Boston, doctors stopped trying to treat patients. There was simply no way. They simply gave morphine to dull the pain and waited for death to arrive. Nurses worked 20-hour shifts until they collapsed from exhaustion or contracted the disease. In Paris, funeral homes couldn't keep up. Coffins sold out within a week. Bodies were stacked on trucks like firewood and buried in mass graves dug by prisoners because there were no living gravediggers left. And do you know what the most desperate part was? People did everything they could to protect themselves. They wore garlic necklaces, drank alcohol from morning onward, and burned incense day and night. Some even covered their windows, thinking the night air would bring the disease. Nothing worked. The brutal truth is that in 1918, when you contracted the Spanish flu, your only option was to pray. And most of the time, even that didn't help. And when people stopped being able to pray, when there was no one left to pray, then you understand the true magnitude of what was happening. The numbers I'm going to show you now will leave you in absolute shock. In just 18 months, between 1918 and 1920, the Spanish flu killed between 50 and 100 million people. To give you an idea of what that means, World War I, which lasted for years of total carnage, killed 17 million. The flu killed at least 3 times as many in less than half the time. 1 in 3 people on the planet was infected. 1 in 3. If you, your parents, and your brother were alive in 1918, statistically one of you would catch the disease. And if you did, you had a 60% chance of dying. Let that sink in for a moment. 60%. But global numbers don't reveal the true horror. I'll tell you what happened city by city, country by country. In India, 17 million people died. 17 million. Entire villages disappeared from the map. In some regions, the population fell by half in 6 months. Farmland lay empty because there was no one left to work. The railway system ground to a halt because there were no more train drivers alive. In Brazil, the city of São Paulo lost nearly 100,000 inhabitants. Rio de Janeiro became a ghost town. The streets were literally covered with corpses. The urban sanitation service collapsed. Rats infested the central neighborhoods. The mayor declared a state of emergency and asked for help from the federal government, which was also collapsing. In Samoa, a small island in the Pacific, 22% of the population died. 22%. Imagine that. 10 people, more than to die in a few months. Entire families became extinct. Ancient cultural traditions were lost because there was no one left to pass them on. But perhaps the most frightening example is Alaska. Isolated Eskimo communities, never before encountered with modern influenza, were completely devastated. In some villages, the mortality rate reached 80%. 80%. Only 1 or 2 people survived from entire communities. The global economic system completely collapsed. Factories closed because there were no workers. Farms were abandoned because there were no farmers. Maritime trade stopped because there were no sailors. In New York, The stock exchange operated only 3 days a week because there were not enough employees. The funeral system simply disappeared. In London, bodies lay in homes for days because there was no one to collect them. In Chicago, prisoners were temporarily released to dig graves, and many died unknowingly digging their own graves. Churches overflowing with corpses became temporary storage facilities. In Buenos Aires, the archbishop cancelled all religious services because there were no living priests. Faith itself was tested when people realized that even prayer was not saving anyone. And here lies the most disturbing fact of all. In many cities, more people died of hunger and thirst than from the flu itself, because when all the bakers die, there's no bread. When all the firefighters die, there's no clean water. When all the doctors die, even a cut on your finger becomes a death sentence. The population density of entire countries plummeted to levels that only recovered decades later. The Spanish flu didn't just kill a generation, it nearly extinguished civilization as we know it. And now comes the question you don't want to hear the answer to. Why you, specifically you, watching this in 2025, wouldn't survive 1918. You probably think you would, that with your modern knowledge, your hygiene, your superior intelligence, you'd get away with it. You're completely wrong, and I'll explain exactly why. First, your immune system is much weaker than you think. It sounds contradictory, but it's the simple truth. You grew up in a sterilized world, antibiotics since childhood, vaccines for everything, pasteurized food, treated water, air conditioning, filtering the air you breathe. Do you know what that means? Your body never truly learned to fight. The people of 1918 had immune systems brutally trained by decades of exposure to disease. Yet, millions died. If you take antibiotics for a sore throat, you wouldn't last 2 days. Second, your dependence on modern medical technology. You think you know your body, but I bet you can't even check your own temperature without a digital thermometer. In 1918, when your temperature rose to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees Celsius, you would panic completely. When you started coughing up blood, you would rush to a hospital that doesn't exist. There would be no supplemental oxygen for when your lungs began to fill with fluid. There would be no fluid for hydration when you stopped being able to drink water. There would be no morphine to dull the pain when every breath became torture. You would die in agony, conscious of every second. Third, where you live today would have killed you in 1918. An apartment in a big city, a death sentence. You use public transportation, work in a closed office, go to shopping malls, gyms, restaurants. In 1918, each of these activities would have been like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the drum. The Spanish flu spread faster in densely populated cities. New York, London, and Paris were all devastated. If you lived in a modern metropolis, you'd be at the epicenter of the apocalypse. Your apartment neighbors would be vectors of contamination. The elevator you take every day would be a biological gas chamber. Fourth, your hygiene habits, which you consider modern, were actually fatal in 1918. You shower every day, right? Wrong move. In 1918, that would have meant using contaminated water daily. Do you brush your teeth with industrial toothpaste? It didn't exist. You used deodorant, perfume, and creams. All of this created a false sense of cleanliness, while viruses multiplied on your skin. And what's more, you wouldn't recognize the symptoms until it was too late. You'd wake up with a headache, thinking, wow, I binged on Netflix yesterday. You'd feel feverish and think, it must be work stress. By the time you finally realized you had the Spanish flu, you'd already infected dozens of people. Your family, your colleagues, strangers on the street. Fifth, your modern mind would be your worst enemy. You're used to having answers for everything. Google medical specialists, specific medications for every symptom. In 1918, when you realized there was no solution, no cure, no salvation, you would fall into total despair. Panic would kill you even before the flu. People died of heart attacks after seeing entire family members disappear. The stress of not understanding what was happening, of having no control over anything, destroyed any chance of recovery. The most brutal truth, even if by some miracle you survived the infection, you wouldn't survive the world that would come after. Without reliable electricity, without a banking system, without supermarkets, without the internet, you who probably don't even know how to make a fire or grow food, would die of hunger or cold soon after. You are not stronger than your ancestors, you are more fragile. And in 1918, that would have been a death sentence. But when all seemed lost, when humanity was literally on the brink of extinction, when doctors were giving up and governments were collapsing, something absolutely extraordinary began to happen. and it will completely change your perspective on what human beings are capable of. The survivors not only refused to die, they refused to give up on civilization. In Boston, when all the city's doctors were dead or dying, women with no medical training organized seamstresses, housewives, factory workers. They invaded abandoned hospitals and began caring for the sick. They knew nothing about viruses or medicine, but they knew one thing: someone had to try. These women created the first basic isolation protocols in history. They separated the sick by gravity, washed their hands obsessively, and wore cloth faces as primitive masks. They didn't save everyone, but they saved thousands. And most importantly, they proved that it was possible to fight the impossible. In India, when the railway system collapsed, villagers walked hundreds of miles, carrying supplies to isolated communities. Hindus and Muslims living in conflict banded together to save lives. These, who couldn't even touch each other, worked side by side, digging graves and caring for orphans. In Sao Paulo, when authorities fled the city, bakers who had lost their families continued making bread. They worked 16 hours a day alone in their bakeries, distributing free food to those still alive. Some died of exhaustion over the dough they were making, but the most incredible revolution happened in science. Doctors who had lost everything, family, career, hope, locked themselves in makeshift laboratories and began a desperate race against time. Without modern equipment, without funding, only basic microscopes and brutal determination. This was how modern virology was born. Scientists like Oswald I spent days without sleep studying blood samples from victims. They couldn't stop the Spanish flu, but they discovered fundamental secrets about how the virus works. Secrets that would save billions of lives in the following decades. Medicine itself had to completely reinvent itself. Hospitals that what were once death deposits became research centers. Nurses developed intensive care techniques we still use today. The concept of supportive therapy, keeping the patient alive while the body fights the disease, was born in the trenches of the Spanish flu. And perhaps the most profound change, humanity learned to work together on a global scale. Countries that had just emerged from a world war began sharing medical information. Telegrams crossed oceans carrying data on treatments that worked, symptoms to watch for, and ways to protect survivors. The Red Cross, which had previously cared only for soldiers, expanded to become the first global humanitarian organization. Volunteers traveled to entire continents to help strangers. The idea that we are a single species that needs to protect ourselves collectively was born from the ashes of the Spanish flu. In less than 2 years, cities that had become open-air cemeteries were being rebuilt. Families who had lost everything adopted stranger orphans. Communities invented new rituals, new traditions, new ways of living that honored the dead but celebrated the living. What came of this? The apocalypse wasn't just a traumatized humanity, it was a stronger, more united, more prepared humanity. The seeds of modern medicine, international cooperation, and global public health were sown in the most fertile soil. Human despair transformed into unshakable hope. And now we come to the question you've probably been asking yourself since the beginning of this video. What does this story from 1918 have to do with the world we live in today? The answer will scare you more than anything you've heard so far. In 2020, when COVID-19 arrived, you saw exactly the same scenes from 1918 repeat themselves. Hospitals overwhelmed, healthcare systems collapsing, people dying alone, the economy grinding to a halt. The difference is that in 2020 we had ventilators, ICUs, and vaccines developed in record time, and yet the world nearly stopped. Now imagine if COVID had the lethality of the Spanish flu. If instead of killing 2% of those infected, it killed 60%. If instead of attacking primarily, if the virus attacked the elderly, it attacked young people in their 20s and 30s. What do you think would have happened to our advanced civilization? The inconvenient truth is that we are much more fragile today than in 1918. It sounds crazy, but let me explain why. First, our global supply chain. In 1918, if a city were isolated, it could still survive. It had local agriculture, local artisans, a local economy. Today, if trucks stopped running for 2 weeks, supermarkets would be empty. If cargo ships stopped running, hospitals would run out of medicine. Did you see this during the pandemic? There were shortages of hand sanitizer, masks, even toilet paper, and that was in a relatively mild pandemic. Imagine during a real catastrophe. Second, our technological dependence. In 1918, when electricity was out, people lit candles and continued living. Today, if the internet goes down for 24 hours, banks shut down, hospitals panic, emergency systems collapse. Our entire civilization depends on cables and servers that can be destroyed by a solar storm or an attack cybernetic. Third, our urban population. In 1918, 70% of people lived in the countryside. Today, 70% live in cities. This means that, in the next pandemic, billions of people will be crammed precisely where viruses spread fastest. New York, São Paulo, Mumbai, Lagos, biological bombs waiting to explode. And there's more. Our viruses today are far more dangerous than those of 1918. They travel by plane, reaching anywhere in the world within 12 hours. The Spanish flu took months to leave Kansas and reach Brazil. Today, a virus can leave Uranus on a Monday and be in São Paulo on Tuesday. Scientists already know that the next major pandemic isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And it could be much worse than 1918. Avian flu viruses with a 60% fatality rate already exist. They just need to learn how to transmit between humans. Viruses manufactured in laboratories can leak, as possibly happened with COVID. But here it is, the scariest part. Our response in 2020 showed we learned nothing from 1918. Rich countries hoarded vaccines while poor countries died. Scientific information was politicized. People denied the existence of the disease, even as they watched relatives die. In 1918, without the internet, fake news, or extreme political polarization, people at least believed the disease existed. Today, we have all the world's information in the palm of our hands, and yet, millions of people believed vaccines had chips, that viruses were invented, that masks were dictatorship. If a new Spanish flu were to arrive today, with social media spreading panic and lies, with conspiracy theories going viral faster than the virus itself, with countries closing borders and hoarding resources, it would be absolute chaos. And do you know what the worst part of all is? Unlike 1918, today we have the tools to prepare. We have the science, we have the technology, we have the resources, but we lack the political will, nor the necessary global cooperation. The question isn't whether we'll face another devastating pandemic. The question is, when will it happen? When the pandemic arrives, will we react like our ancestors of 1918, united, determined, willing to sacrifice everything to save the species? Or will we repeat the mistakes of 2020, only on a much, much worse scale? But the real lesson of the Spanish flu isn't about our fragility. It's not about the fear of what might come. The real lesson is about something much more powerful, our absurd and unshakable ability to survive the impossible. Think about what you just heard. In 1918, 100 million people died. Entire cities disappeared. Civilization nearly collapsed. And do you know what happened next? Humanity didn't just survive, it built the most prosperous century in history. The 1920s were called the Roaring Twenties, precisely because the people who survived the apocalypse decided to live each day as if it were their last. Art, music, literature, science, everything exploded in a frenetic celebration of life, as if humanity were saying, "You tried to destroy us, now look at what we are capable of creating." The medicine that saved your life dozens of times was born in the trenches of 1918. Antibiotics, ICUs, ventilators, vaccines, emergency protocols. Everything was developed by people who saw the worst of humanity and decided to build the best. And here's what impresses me most. The survivors of 1918 had no idea they were planting the seeds of the future. That nurse in Boston who obsessively washed her hands didn't know she was creating hospital hygiene protocols. That scientist who spent sleepless nights studying dead viruses didn't know he was saving billions of future lives. They simply refused to give up. This is what sets our species apart from anything else that has ever existed on this planet. We're not the strongest. Bears are stronger. We're not the fastest. Leopards are faster. We don't have the best natural defenses. Turtles have hooves, porcupines have spines. But we have something no other species has. When everything falls apart, when it seems like it's over, when death is literally knocking at our door, we find a strength we never knew existed. And we don't just survive, we become better. Every catastrophe in human history has spawned breakthroughs, revolutionary ones. The Black Death created the Renaissance. Great wars accelerated technology by decades. The Spanish flu created modern medicine, and yes, even COVID-19 has taught us valuable lessons about global cooperation, vaccine development, and remote work. So when the next major crisis arrives, and it will remember this, you're not just facing a pandemic, a natural disaster, a war, or an economic crisis, you're participating in humanity's next great evolution. The challenges we face today, climate change, future pandemics, resource scarcity, global conflicts, are not the end of our story, they're the next chapter. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the next chapters are always more incredible than the last. Our ancestors in 1918 looked at a world covered in corpses and decided to build hospitals. They looked at empty cities and decided to rebuild them bigger and better. They looked at absolute despair and chose hope. And do you know why they did this? Because they knew a fundamental truth we sometimes forget. We are not fragile by chance. We are resilient by nature. Every cell in your body was shaped by billions of years of survival. You are a direct descendant of people who survived ice ages, medieval plagues, world wars, natural disasters. The DNA that runs through your veins carries the memory of every impossible victory of the human species. So, the next time the world seems daunting, when the news fills you with fear, when you think we may not be able to overcome the challenges ahead, remember this story. Remember that you are part of the species that survived the Spanish flu. And if our ancestors managed to rebuild an entire civilization using only willpower, basic knowledge, and an absolute refusal to give up, imagine what we can do with all our technology, our science, our ability to instantly connect with people around the world. The future isn't something that happens to us. The future is something we create. And if history has taught us anything, it's that when humanity sets out to create something, there's no force in the universe that can stop us. We are stronger than we think. We always have been, and always will be. And now, tell me something. After everything you've learned about 1918, do you still think you know history? Because I'm sure there's at least one person in your life who needs to hear this story. Someone who complains about hard times without even realizing what our ancestors really faced. Share this video with them. Seriously, sometimes we need a dose of perspective to understand how lucky we are to be alive today. And if this story impacted you as much as it did me when I discovered these facts, leave a like below. This shows me it's worth continuing to dig into these absurd stories that no one properly tells, since you've made it this far. And man, thanks. For that, you'll definitely want to watch the video that's showing on your screen right now. It's about another event that literally changed the course of humanity and that you've probably never heard of. It's even more surreal than the Spanish flu, and subscribe to the channel too, because every week I bring you real stories that are more impressive than any movie. Things that really happened and will completely change how you see the world. Leave a comment telling me which part of this story shocked you most. The speed of death, the absurd numbers, or the fact that humanity not only survived but emerged stronger. I read every comment, and your answers always give me ideas for future videos. See you in the next story. And remember, you are stronger than you think.